We're here with a regional lead for Middle East and Africa for Airbnb, Velma Corcoran. Thank you so much for joining us. Velma, let's start with your history at Airbnb. You've been there for close on 8 years now. Take us through how you started at Airbnb and what that initial stage of the company was like.
So I started 2016. I was the first person with boots on the ground in Africa. Started as a kind of a country lead for South Africa. And really the idea was then the company was young, really, really fast growing. No one had even thought about Africa. And so it was to have someone on the ground to start to understand what should our regional strategy look like. So, at that point, it was a lot about meeting with hosts, trying to understand the community, starting to have some conversation with governments to try and get some partnerships on the ground. And then really thinking about what could be some kind of partnerships or what do we do from a business development perspective that could accelerate growth in the region. So I did that for, a few months, and then we launched Airbnb Experiences, and I was very bullish and decided that we needed to put Africa in the map. So we got Cape Town and Nairobi in the first 12 cities for launch. So I spent quite a lot of time actually building up the experiences product from the ground up, which was a lot of fun. I got to meet some really, really cool people and build that community. And then I think, from there over the last, it's been a wild roller coaster because in the middle of that was COVID. And so my role has expanded to where I now look after government relations, public policy, and business development across Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah, that sounds challenging because few people who don't know about Africa, haven't worked in Africa, they kind of see it as a monolith, and it really isn't. Like South Africa's regulations are going to be very different from Kenya's. So that sounds like quite a task to deal with so many governments that are so reliant on tourism.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that you need to do, we've got a small team and we look after 72 countries. So we have to be really, really ruthless in terms of where we focus and where we do things proactively. So our predominant focus at the moment is South Africa and the UAE, because those are our two biggest markets. But we're also really sort of thinking about what are the ways and the tools that we have that we can scale that. So actually yesterday we had an event called the Africa Travel Summit, and part of that we announced a pledge. We've seen really, really good economic growth in South Africa. We launched a report last week that said we doubled our contribution to GDP since 2019, which is really significant. 23 billion rand to the South African economy, supporting 50,000 jobs. And what we wanted to do with the Africa Travel Summit is think through how do we scale that growth into Africa in a way that is inclusive and sustainable? And really, how do we support governments and make sure that Airbnb is seen as something that is good for the communities that our hosts and guests live in? And so what we plan to do next year is actually start to develop a kind of a playbook, white paper for African governments that looks at what are some of the low-hanging fruits for using Airbnb to grow tourism sustainably and inclusively, and then what are the appropriate regulatory solutions that work in this context, because obviously what works in Africa is very different to what works in Europe, is very different to what works across, Asia. So that's the first step. The second thing is that what governments often want is they actually just want to know what is the Airbnb activity that's happening in their market or their region. So we've got a tool for governments called the City Portal, which gives them insight to aggregate data. So we're going to expand that to 10 more countries across Africa. And then we're also expanding things like we've put together a fund to support the tourism ecosystem. And we've got a skills development program called the Entrepreneurship Academy, which we're also going to be expanding.
So much I'd love to follow up on there, but I think we have to get to the meat and potatoes. And the reason we got in contact in the first place is the government of South Africa and the Ministry of Tourism recently put out a green paper. And just one of the items in that green paper, it doesn't focus specifically on tech platforms, but certainly it's a section of that paper, and it doesn't mention Airbnb by name, but it certainly mentions Airbnb by function. So firstly, what's in that green paper? Let's start there for the viewers who might not be familiar at all.
So I think what's really important to understand is a green paper is a discussion document. And what it's looking at is what should be the policy direction for tourism kind of looking into the future. You also have to understand that policy has to be designed in such a way that it has longevity. You can't be changing your policy, every few years. And actually, the last time there was a green paper was 1994. So there's a lot that's changed. So that is a discussion document that sets the policy direction for South Africa, for tourism across kind of a number of different things. One of those is how is the government thinking about technology and within that short-term rentals. So some of the proposals in there are around creating a differentiated system for short-term rentals, which we actually think is a really good thing. So we have, for a very long time, probably the last 3 or 4 years, really called on national government to say we need to create regulation for short-term rentals. It's interesting. As soon as people hear regulation, they often jump to, oh my God, this is terrible, it's clamping down. We actually believe that regulation, if it is simple, if it's appropriate, and if it's proportionate, can be a really good thing because it provides clarity. It takes our hosts out of the kind of the gray zone, and it can enable government. So the kinds of proposals that we've put on the table is to say, we think now is the right time for new rules for short-term rentals that can enable ordinary South Africans, families to continue hosting in their homes and to use this as a way to make some extra money, but then put in place more stringent measures potentially for those that are considered bad actors or who are more professional. The thing is that in order to create regulation, you actually really need to know what you're solving for. And that has to be done based on evidence. So, ultimately what's coming out of the green paper is to say, what we really want to do is we want to drive tourism. Tourism growth is critical. And at the same time, we want to enable small and medium enterprises to be able to come into the tourism sector. So, and I think from that, you then need to say, okay, well, what are the right and the kind of the most appropriate policy?
Yeah. And so part of what the green paper talks about, and perhaps it's worth throwing in here, part of the important context here is while the green paper is a discussion document, there is actually a draft, not a draft law, an amendment bill in front of Parliament right now that introduces, firstly, the term short-term rental, and then allows the minister to set certain limits on how much that short-term rental is allowed to be rented out in a year. And so with that context in mind, and the fact that the green paper itself mentions thresholds for short-term rentals, is that the concern? Is that it's like a blunt instrument to just say all short-term rentals can only be rented out 90 days out of every X?
I mean, I think what's important context is that a month ago, we signed an MOU with the Ministry of Tourism specifically on this topic. So, I mean, in terms of where the tourism amendment bill is, I think that's a question you need to ask the Department of Tourism. My understanding is that the green paper and the sort of the policy direction that's in the green paper will precede any regulation, and then the regulation will come from that. So the MOU that we've had with the Ministry of Tourism said a couple of things. One is that we want to work together on regulation, and that the first step of that is a national registration system for short-term rentals. And that should be, something that firstly, a definition is a good thing because actually it defines what the activity is. So we're very supportive of that. So anyone who wants to do short-term rentals should register. That registration should be online. It should be free. It should be easy to access. That will then give the department the evidence and the data to know actually what's happening and what are the problems that they're solving for. I think, thresholds is a measure that you bring in if you want to limit short-term rental activity for very specific reasons. So maybe there's a housing crisis, or potentially you have over tourism. Right now, there is no actual evidence to suggest that either of those are a problem in the South African context. And actually, my understanding is that we want to grow tourism. And so the very, very first step is the national registration system. And then from there, depending on what the evidence suggests, then you can start to bring in more kind of appropriate regulation. I think the other thing that I want to say is that, like, genuinely, the majority of our hosts on Airbnb are like ordinary South Africans that are generally that have, a room in their home that they want to share, or they've got a garden cottage, or they've got one property. The typical income for a host on Airbnb is 32,000 Rand a year, which if you're running a business is not great. But if you've got a side hustle and you're using it because you want to pay the school fees or petrol or whatever it is, that's a decent amount of income. And I think
it's 2,000 Rand a month, right?
Yeah. And I think typically what you want to do with regulation is you want to find mechanisms to separate between people who are doing this occasionally, a family that's using it to make some additional income in their primary residence, versus someone who's doing this professionally. And we have said from the very beginning that we think that you almost need a sliding scale of regulation. So make it really super easy for the small guys to get in. But as soon as you become a business, and if you have 5 or 10 or 15 properties, then obviously you need to be, treated as a business, and there need to be more kind of stringent regulation.
Yeah, and this is now where things get hairy and the discussion gets quite interesting. Part of the privilege I've had is I've been able to travel all around South Africa, and so I've been able to chat to Airbnb hosts and guest house owners and that sort of thing. And so this is where the data-led approach that you spoke about becomes interesting, and to understand perhaps what the extent of the problem is, because what I have are anecdotes. And so, for example, the one guest house owner, who also happens to be the chair of the guest house association there, mentioned that she, for example, saw someone that she knows in the industry, put their listings on Airbnb, but now that's a guest house. But it's not zoned as a business. They don't pay the tourism levy. So all of a sudden, this competitor of hers in the market is able to completely undercut her because she's not paying business rates. She's, not paying the dues to the municipality for operating a guest house type business. And so, whereas traditional guest houses costs are substantially higher, even DSTV is charged differently if you're a business and an accommodation business versus if you're a private home.
And what you're saying is exactly why we need regulation, and why we have been for regulation for the longest time. So I think what is critical is Airbnb is a platform. And on our platform, we have loads of different accommodation types. You can go and stay in a room in someone's house. You can rent out a garden cottage. You can rent out a villa, or you can go and stay in a guest house. You can even stay in a hotel on Airbnb. So there are lots of different accommodation types. What we're saying is that, and that's why the definition of what a short-term rental is so critical, because a short-term rental is different from a guest house. So if you create the category, and if you say there's a differentiated system for regulation for short-term rentals, and it is simple, it's super easy to do, and it's proportionate. So you say that, okay, well, someone who's doing this occasionally for a few days, 30 or 60 days a year needs to be subject to different rules than someone who's doing this professionally. So if someone is running a guest house, whether they're on Airbnb or not, because in that case, Airbnb is just a marketing platform, they need to be subject to similar rules. But it also begs the question of, actually, shouldn't we just be simplifying things across the board? Like, to really look at what's out there and kind of go, if things feel really bureaucratic, like, let's get rid of it. Let's get rid of red tape, because ultimately we want to enable tourism. We want to enable, small, medium businesses to thrive. And also, I think what is key is, and this is part of, so the MOU that we have with the Ministry of Tourism does a couple of things. So one, we talk about the registration system. 2, we talk about how do we share best practice and learnings from other places around the world. We talk about collaboration on our Airbnb Entrepreneurship Academy, and we talk about how do we grow tourism to South Africa. But part of the education is that actually what platforms like Airbnb do is they take away some of the need for lots of regulation. So why do you want to regulate? Because you want to make sure that the place is safe, the place is clean, the place is of high quality.
Yeah. So like food certificates and liquor licenses, for example, come to mind as a common complaint from
Yes,
traditional.
well, absolutely. But if Airbnbs are generally self-catering, so they, if you're offering food and you've got a liquor license, you should fall into a different category. I think that the thing is that Airbnb's got just to give you a sense, we have more than 2 million guests staying in an Airbnb any given night of the year. So we have a review system that really looks at quality, trust, safety on the platform. And so it's sort of, do you really need in-person checks if the platform already allows for that? We've got air cover. We insure both our hosts and our guests if anything goes wrong. So, I think it's important to really understand.
Sort of stepping into the gap of third-party liability cover.
Absolutely. So if if a booking
place.
happens on Airbnb, if you're a host and something goes wrong, you have got both liability protection as well as damages protection. We've also got something called air cover for guests. So if you get to a place and it's not what you think it is, we will rebook you into a different place or kind of completely refund you to the same value to make sure that you're happy with that experience.
So an important piece of context I wanted to mention in the lead up to my previous question, based on something that you said, was that the legislation, the amendment bill, which, by the way, the only thing it doesn't do is it doesn't just tackle short-term rentals. It did a bunch of other stuff as well. But that was back in 2019, before COVID. So the circumstances have changed dramatically. And as you mentioned, South Africa is trying to bounce back and trying to get its tourism sector back on track since then. So back in 2019, there were lots of complaints like the one I just relayed, where essentially you saw hosts sidestepping government regulation because it was more efficient to do so, and using Airbnb as one way to do
But how
that.
can you say that there's sidestepping regulation if there isn't regulation?
So
the regulation deals with businesses.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is that actually what Airbnb has enabled, which is really, really good, is to allow everyday South Africans. You don't have to be a tourism business. You can be, I'm a super host. I have a little garden cottage.
Yeah.
I host. I'm not a tourism professional. It helps pay the bills. I mean, I've just, been...
I'm talking about a 5-bedroom house that is exclusively being used for rentals. So no one lives in that house. The person renting out that house is in fact an a tourism industry professional. This is what they do, and essentially what they were avoiding was, and honestly, the point that you made about the government perhaps needing to do some introspection about like its red tape is 100% valid, and I wanted to get to that because essentially the Msunduzi municipality, that's Peter Maritzburg's municipality, they charge these businesses a tidy sum of money just for the privilege of operating. Before you are allowed to sign in your first guest, you are hundreds of thousands of rands in the hole. And so I think that's where the complaints come from, is like and you see this all over with disruptive businesses like Airbnb. You see cab drivers complaining about it with respect to Uber. You see broadcasters complaining about it with respect to Netflix. I would agree with you that government should look at what these business owners are doing and saying, oh, they are seeking efficiency. Why? And how can we help that? So they're trying to sidestep this bureaucracy. And why? Is it too expensive? Is that expense necessary? So kind of prune down all of these not loopholes, all of these hoops that business owners have to jump through just to get their business up and running, so that they don't have to try to bend themselves in knots to sidestep the regulation. But I also recognize that our government might not be so keen to let go of those revenue streams, right? So assuming that they won't amend those regulations, and that Airbnb will have to fall in with those regulations. So not just creating new regulations, but falling in with South Africa's existing business regulations. What responsibility is there on Airbnb in that respect, and what responsibility isn't there?
I think to compare where we are right now in 2022 to 2019 is irrelevant. The world has fundamentally shifted. COVID has changed the way we think. It's also changed the way that we travel. Also, Airbnb's business is, we've doubled our contribution to GDP. We are a significant driver of economic growth in this country. And that's also, it's South Africans traveling because it's affordable and accessible. And it's also it's an economic lifeline for a lot of South Africans. I feel really, really good about our relationship, not just with the Minister of Tourism, but with the Department of Tourism. The fact that this green paper has come out post-COVID, and what it's saying is that we want to enable tourism growth. We want to let go of, we want to enable small and medium businesses, and we want to create a differentiated system for short-term rentals, is for me a really, really good thing. I have not heard the Tourism Amendment Bill mentioned since like 2019. So my sense is that there's no, the focus for the minister is on the Tourism Master Plan and on the Green Paper. So I honestly don't see that necessarily as a threat right now. And I think that the thing is that what you want to do is actually for regulation to work, it has to be simple. Has to be clear. It has to make sense, because otherwise what people are going to do is they're going to flout the rules.
Yeah.
And so, what the kind of the proposals are is that you create a national framework that is evidence-based. And then what you do is you give local governments the tools so that they could put things in place to solve for what they want. So if what, the Pietermaritzburg municipality wants to do is for small, if there is a place that's got, if someone who has, more than 5 properties, or if there is a place that is, more than 5 bedrooms, if they consider that to be a business, then what they can do is they can change the bylaws so that it ensures that that person pays more taxes. I think the key thing is that if you want, so generally what we see is that our hosts want to play by the rules. The rules are just not super clear, and they're confusing. So I think the more you can create a way that they're simple and that they're common sense, the more people will play by the rules.
And that I think hits the nail completely on the head. Common sense rules, right? And I think that's what South Africans are most frustrated with, is when rules get put in place and you go, that's ridiculous. And that's when people start getting creative about bypassing them, is because they don't agree with the rules and they think that they're stupid, and so they find ways to avoid them. I think that part of what we're seeing in the tourism industry, what's led to this green paper, what's led to the conflict perhaps between Airbnb and traditional accommodation businesses.
I want to say there's no conflict. We are members of the Tourism Business Council. The CEO of the Tourism Business Council was at our event yesterday. I think everyone loves to create a story of like conflict between Airbnb and the traditional hospitality sector, conflict between Airbnb and the Ministry of Tourism. Actually, all we want to do is we want to be good partners. We want common sense rules, because we know that we can help grow tourism to this country. And if you look at yourself, it's not a case of staying in an Airbnb or in a hotel. It's both and. Because sometimes when I travel, I will stay in an Airbnb because I'm traveling with my family and my children and my dog, and I need self-catering. Or if I'm going for a luxury weekend away with my husband, I want to stay in a 5-star hotel. So, I think there really is space for everybody in this industry. And ultimately, what we need right now in South Africa is to grow tourism. It's one of the key sectors that can drive economic growth.
Yeah. And to get to more philosophical on a point you raised, I think conflict gets a bad rap, because conflict can be incredibly positive. So, and perhaps just a definition issue, but like the fact is the Springboks play their best rugby when the All Blacks are on the field.
Let's hope so.
Right. So,
is that a prediction for Saturday?
So I'm certainly predicting this podcast is probably going to come out after the game is won by the Springboks. But The fact is the conflict brings out it can bring out it shaves off what is unnecessary, and like the reason for the old idiom steel sharpens steel and so on is like the way to get to I think the best solution is often through conflict. And so you've got what's amazing, or at least from my perspective. So I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? But from where I'm sitting, I see a bunch of parties, whether it's the Ministry of Tourism, the Department of Tourism, the Tourism Council, Airbnb, traditional guest houses, that actually all want the same thing.
100%.
Right.
And like you say, the green paper is a discussion document. Obviously, we're not going to agree with everything in it, but we can have the discussion. And, we're part of the Tourism Business Council. We're not necessarily going to agree with everyone else around the table, but it's part of being like having a seat at the table, having the debate. And if what the ultimate outcome is kind of common sense regulation that can enable and grow tourism, then I think within that you can find really workable solutions.
Yeah. And so to play devil's advocate one more time, so I think what is going to disappoint, my friend in Pietermaritzburg, who runs a guest house, is that it looked for a while there as if the then Minister Derek Hanekom, was responding quite quickly, firstly to pressure from within the industry, but also to real concerns that they had, that they were being disadvantaged because they kind of came from legacy rules, and now there's a disruptor in the market showing, oh, hang on a second, but how many of these rules are really necessary? And it looked like things were changing quickly, and now all of a sudden things have slowed down. Now we're first talking about a green paper, and after a green paper, a white paper, and after a white paper, a draft bill, after a draft bill, cabinet, after cabinet, parliament, after parliament, more discussion. We're looking at what, 3.5 years minimum, and so to them, I can understand that they would be quite disappointed that things have suddenly slowed down instead of, like, it looked like it was moving at pace, but now things have slowed down. So what relief is there for them in the meantime while they wait for government to catch up to where tourism is in 2023?
I mean, I feel like that's a question you should be asking the Minister of Tourism and not me.
Yeah.
I mean, I share the frustrations of your friend in Pietermaritzburg. We've been calling for, regulation for a very, very long time. Our hosts on Airbnb want regulation as much as, that person, does, because actually people just want clarity and certainty to be able to get on with the rules. I get really irritated when people refer to Airbnb as a disruptor. We are not a disruptor. We are very much part of the tourism industry. If you think we're contributing to 50,000 jobs, 23 billion rand to the South African economy, that's
Disruptors
double,
also get a bad rap.
Double what it was, in 2019. And that growth is driven by South Africans. It's dispersing travel across the country. It's good growth.
Disruptor used to be a good word, I guess.
But I think we've kind
now.
we've got to the point where we're part of, Airbnb is a noun and a verb. We are so much part of, like, the fabric of tourism, and I think we can, in a good way. And so, I think, so that's I think we've moved beyond, and I think that's also one of the kind of the fundamental shifts, is that we've moved beyond a space where Airbnb is this sort of like disruptor that's kind of that people should feel threatened by, to very much part of kind of the fabric of tourism and how we travel and how South Africans make some, additional money.
Your competitors locally and abroad have incorporated very much what Airbnb do into their platforms, right? So off the top of my head, Booking.com and AfriStay also allow people to rent out rooms.
Yeah.
It's not just traditional accommodation businesses on there.
Yeah, and a lot of the hotels are moving into short-term rentals as well.
Yeah. Velma, I as a thank you for letting me grill you for 40 minutes. So I wanted to let you absolutely say what you came to say. So you've mentioned your MOU with the tourism ministry. You've mentioned the economic impact report findings, and you've mentioned the tourism pledge, but perhaps it's worth delving a bit deeper into the most recent thing, the pledge, $500,000 for Africa.
Sure. So maybe if I can say what I came to say, let me just take a step back. So the pledge actually comes from 2017. We made an commitment to inclusive tourism in South Africa. Right?
What does that mean, inclusive and sustainable tourism?
So inclusive tourism is really about how can you spread the benefits of tourism to communities that haven't traditionally benefited from tourism. So how do we make sure that more people in township and rural communities can truly benefit from tourism, so that you're moving tourism away from tourism like traditional tourism areas into lesser known tourism areas, and that communities are genuinely benefiting from that.
The Eastern Cape comes to mind.
Yeah, 100%.
Which the government's trying to just about building a road down there, but
and we've just done a project in the Waterberg, for example. So what are these lesser visited but actually really cool tourism destinations? So that pledge was based on developing a program called the Airbnb Entrepreneurship Academy, which is a skills development program focused on hosts from township and rural communities and how do we bring them onto the platform and actually make them successful. And then we ran something called the Africa Travel Summit in 2018 in Langa in Cape Town. And that was how can technology accelerate inclusive and sustainable growth in Africa in travel? And we brought together 200 influencers, policymakers, thought leaders from across the continent. So fast forward 5 years, things have fundamentally changed. COVID has shifted everything. And so what we wanted to do was actually reconvene that summit, but think about how does technology accelerate inclusive and sustainable tourism in a post-pandemic world. So we hosted it this last week, yesterday, in fact, at Victoria Yards in Joburg. And it was it was a wonderful event. And off the back of that, we wanted to make a pledge, which was, what are we going to do to play our part as Airbnb? And so there's $500,000, the Airbnb Community Fund, and we've ring-fenced money from that. And that will go to development organizations and NGOs focused on building out the ecosystem. So one of the challenges of growing inclusive tourism growth in this South Africa and in Africa is that there are a lot of structural and systemic barriers. So digital access, skills, Wi-Fi, load shedding, you name it. So how do we contribute to organizations that are actually building the ecosystem? So skills development, Wi-Fi access, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other components to the pledge are taking the Airbnb Entrepreneurship Academy to more countries in Africa, and then really trying to work with governments to say what are the most appropriate regulations that can enable short-term rentals and foster inclusive growth. We have an incredible opportunity in Africa. So if we look at what's happened so Airbnb is a lot more mature in lots of other markets, in the US, in Europe, and we can take all of those lessons of what has worked and what has not worked as we see, Airbnb grow and become more mature across African countries. So, our idea is that actually to engage more proactively and to engage earlier with regulators and to be able to give them the information and the insights that they need. Ultimately, what you can do is you can get better outcomes for the countries as well as for our hosts, so that you're starting to lay the foundation.
Okay. Very exciting. Thank you very much. I know that you said that you have to catch a flight, so I would love to keep talking, but we can't. Unfortunately, the airlines, I don't think, accept interesting conversation as a valid excuse for missing your flight.
Thanks very much for having me.